It begins to look as if we're going to need some extra chairs, and I think there are extra chairs in a classroom across the way. It might be easier to have a few people come down front into the corners than to fill the aisles, but I'm assuming that if everyone has arrived, which is probably not the case, that we can all fit into this room. Let's hope that that proves to be true. I should warn you that if we find that we can't all fit in, we may have to ask those who are, as it were, non-registrants to the colloquium to yield chairs to those who have paid their money. But let's wait and see on that. I want to make a few brief announcements which are directed primarily to the guests of the program. I want to remind those whose travel expenses are being covered by us that we will need information, receipts for airfare, and simply data figures on costs. I will make certain that everyone who is concerned here is approached for such information, perhaps by one of our graduate students. But those of you who are concerned with this should have it in mind. Secondly, the luncheon plans for today will be the same as yesterday. The participants in the colloquium will have lunch provided at Massey College just before 1 o'clock, and if you would plan to gather there, either in the common room or in the general foyer, we'll go upstairs together. I would like to remind all who are part of our colloquium, that is all who have also paid their registration fee, that there is a reception this evening. I think that is mentioned on the flyer. Everyone will be welcome to that. It is at the common room in Massey College from 6 to 8 p.m. I hope that you'll all come for conversation and reasonably relaxed exchange. One other announcement, which again directs itself primarily to those who have spoken for us. The sixth panel, the one on Saturday afternoon, had been set up originally under the rubric literary history, or some such title, suggesting that we would emerge out of confusion into doctrine, which is perhaps at best a vain hope. Our feeling now is that the best wind-up will be an informal exchange of comments by those who have spoken and who would still like to speak. What I would ask, in fact, is that those who have presented papers or those who have been sitting in on discussions and have not had the chance to say what they would like to say, or have afterthoughts or further questions or anything, even some kind of polemical retorts to put forward, if you could let me know, or Francis Sparshot, who will be the chairman of that last panel, we will draw up a list of those who would like to speak. I trust that no one will speak at undue length. And we will simply develop, as it were, a consensus out of a sequence of comments, and I hope there will also be time for discussion. Professor Streeter and Professor Henrich are not entirely off the hook. We still look to them for comments too, but they can, I think, count on support from others as well. I think that's the end of the announcements that I wanted to make. And on the assumption that we're reasonably settled, and I trust the air conditioning will keep the room reasonably cool, perhaps we could turn to our third panel discussion concerned with time and the poetic self. Is that the... Yes, I'm a little embarrassed for that title. I don't think any of the panelists should be held to it. I think I formulated it late at night once in an uncertain moment. I also think there's little need for introductions today. We have a sense, I think, of where we're at. The procedure we will follow will be to have the papers by Professor Fry first, and then by Professor Hartmann second. We will then have the comment from Professor Abrams, and following that from Professor Dickstein. And I trust there will still be some time at the end for discussion. With that, may I ask Professor Fry to take the lectern.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm only a scholar in the Romantic period by fits and starts, so I thought the thing I could most usefully do was, unlikely as it may seem to the chairman, to talk about the theme of time and the poetic self, and to try to provide some kind of context for it. The great difficulty about time, of course, has always been that it is the primary and the most important category of human experience, and yet it doesn't exist. Its center is the present moment, the now, and when we try to grasp the now, we find ourselves pursuing an elusive never quite that keeps vanishing between a no longer and a not yet. As Dylan Thomas says, the atlas eater with a jaw for news bit out the mandrake with tomorrow's scream. Well, the time-honored way of dealing with problems we don't understand is to project them on God and hope that he does. So that in the traditional view, as incorporated into medieval and later Christianity, the human experience of time begins by being contrasted with that of God, whose mind is in a pure present that comprehends both the past and the future. We have an experience of time which means that we can attend to only one thing at a time. And we have been assured, ever since St. Augustine at least, that this is a product of the fall. The Elizabethan poet Sir John Davies says in his poem Nosce te ipsum, "But we that measure times by first and last, the sight of things successively do take, when God on all at once his view doth cast, and of all times doth but one instant make." This leaves on the human level three conceivable forms of experiencing time. At the furthest pole from the mind of God is demonic time, time experienced as simply one clock tick after another, a sense of unending duration without direction or purpose, the kind of experience that is expressed in Macbeth's tomorrow and tomorrow speech. And hell is conceived as this experience of time with death removed. Above this is our ordinary sense of time, which is a mixture of linear and cyclical movement. We also see time in ordinary experience as a universal devourer, with a unique capacity for wiping things out of existence, but we also experience a rotary movement in which spring follows winter and dawn the darkness, and in these brief instants of renewal, there is some sense that a benevolent power may, after all, be concealed somewhere in the machinery. As this view of time is founded on the alienation myth of the fall, there is the possibility of an unfallen experience of time, and there are two questions to be asked about that. One is, what was time like in the Garden of Eden? And the other is, to what extent can this unfallen experience of time be regained now? The higher awareness of time must be connected somehow with the one reassuring aspect of time and ordinary experience, the sense of renewal in the cycles of nature. And this aspect is seen in its complete form in the revolutions of the heavenly bodies, where there is cycle without decline or decay and continuous renewal. The rotation of the heavenly bodies is to be associated with music and the dance, a movement which brings the highest kind of pleasure with it, symbolized by the myth of the music of the spheres. We turn to Sir John Davies' other long poem, Orchestra, where we have the best known treatment in English of the creation of nature as a dance, a harmony of joyous and integrated rhythm. The experience of time in the unfallen state, then, would be the kind of experience represented by the dancer, whose world is not timeless, but where time is an effective exuberance and energy. Its cycles taking place, as Milton says, for change delectable, not need. Davies says, "How justly then is dancing termed new, which with the world in point of time began. Yea, time itself, whose birth Jove never knew, and which is far more ancient than the sun, had not one moment of his age outrun, when out leaped dancing from the heap of things, and lightly rode upon his nimble wings." Davies' poem is said to be sung to Penelope by the chief of her suitors, Antinous, during the absence of Odysseus. The reason is that Penelope's web was taken to be an allegory of nature, its weaving and unweaving, the process of change that goes on around us. The poet says, "So subtle and so curious was the measure, with such unlooked-for change in every strain, as that Penelope, rapt with sweet pleasure, weened she beheld the true proportioned plain of her own web, weaved and unweaved again, but that her art was somewhat less, she thought, and on a mere ignoble subject wrought." Somewhat less, because the world we live in is inferior to the orchestra celebrated by her suitor. The poet uses an ingenious image to express this. While Penelope weaves, her hands are moving in the great dance, but if she were in a completely liberated world, her feet and whole body would be moving too. The prevailing assumption, down to Milton's time at least, is that everything genuinely good for a man, that is in the largest sense educational, tends to raise him from ordinary experience a little nearer to this unfallen level. And this leads us into the kind of activity which can raise us nearer to the kind of thing that orchestra is about, the creative repetition, which is represented by the sacraments of the church in particular. A great deal of the measuring of time in this period was a byproduct of religion, with clocks and bells marking the hours of worship and devotion. The two aspects of cyclical movement, the ordinary and the liberating, are distinguished in Spenser's Mutability cantos. In fact, the distinguishing of them is the whole point of the poem. Nature's final decision on mutability's claim to possess the heavenly world, which is the image of the unfallen state as well as the lower one, is that the heavenly bodies are not changed from their first estate, but by their change their being do dilate, and turning to themselves at length again, do work their own perfection so by fate. Then over them change doth not rule and reign, but they reign over change, and do their states maintain. The line, "do work their own perfection so by fate," indicates the element of creative repetition in the upper cycle. The rotation of the heavenly bodies symbolizes not an unending cycle, but a telos, or purpose of movement, back to their creator. Well, these are the conventionally religious associations with time. Outside the Christian mythology was Eros, the power of love that has a sexual basis, however sublimated it gets later. And for the poets, Eros is another force that raises man to a higher awareness of time. Davies' poem is a love song, and similarly it is Dante's love for Beatrice that impels him up the purgatorial mountain to the unfallen form of his own existence. Even unhappy, frustrated, or rejected love may have the same result, as it does in the beautiful youth sequence of the Shakespeare sonnets. And as nearly all the poets in this period, apart from the dramatists, represented themselves as lovers, and so they were able, even without a doctrine of creative imagination as such, to suggest that poetry itself was a means of acquiring a higher awareness of time. In modern poetry, the Elliott Quartets give us the traditional view of time on 4 levels of experience. In Burnt Norton, which owes a good deal to Davies' orchestra, we begin again with a sense of overwhelming unreality in the ordinary experience of time, where all time is unredeemable. Redemption requires a God, but a God within time is no better off than we are, and a God wholly free of time is of no use to us. Fortunately, we have the incarnation, the descent of something outside time into time, and this creates in time the possibility of a genuine present moment. The recurrence of this moment is represented by the daily repetition of the incarnation in the Mass, and its possible emergence in life is the basis of the arts. In Little Gidding, the conception of Eros is added for the sake of completeness and tradition, but Elliott is not much of a votary of Eros. So the traditional view of time is still poetically viable, as Elliott shows. But its traditional symbol, the sky with its heavenly bodies, has lost most of its prestige. We no longer believe that the heavenly bodies are made of immortal quintessence, or that they move in intelligently guided perfect circles around the earth. Elliott does give us the traditional cosmological dance at the beginning of the second section of Burnt Norton, but the old spatial metaphors of sky and mountain have largely vanished, the incarnation moment being a kind of vortex or shadow mountain. By a century after Newton's time, the heavenly bodies were becoming increasingly an image of mechanism rather than of divine providence in the original state of creation. Hence the number of evil or stupid sky gods in romantic and post-romantic poetry, along with the use of the older construct for parody in Byron's Vision of Judgment and the prologue to Goethe's Faust. When the movements in the sky become thought of as mechanical, we are left with the organism as the highest symbol of being, with man, the conscious organism, at the center. In the older construct, man turns away from the natural environment and attaches himself through love or religion to an ideal form of human community. But now man is thought of as immersed in first his social and then his physical environment. His time consciousness, first of all, expands into the more leisurely temporal rhythms of social continuity. The short time that so haunted Spenser is still short, but the individual's life is interpenetrated by instants when he becomes aware of the slow growth or decline of ideas, religions, or institutions. A very obvious symbol of this enlarged view of time is the wandering Jew who appears in Shelley's Hellas. It follows that both a specifically historical consciousness and a speculative consciousness of the future become elements of the romantic awareness of time. In the background are the still slower rhythms of nature, a nature which is not itself human and yet contains something that complements human experience. This complementary sense of time in nature develops from the 18th century vision of the Sublime, as manifested later in, for instance, the Mont Blanc, that confronts Wordsworth, Coleridge, and Shelley, and inspires them to different and yet curiously interrelated reactions. The sublime, by definition, is not the lovable, and although in Shelley particularly, the association of love and the poetic imagination may still be very close, the basis of the poet's enlarged time consciousness is not his role as a lover, but his function as a poet. Hence, that function is separable from the poet's personality, real or projected. The barrage of scriptural echoes in the defense of poetry shows how deliberately Shelley is replacing the older construct with a new one. Quote, "Their errors have been weighed and found to have been dust in the balance. If their sins were of scarlet, they are now white as snow. They have been washed in the blood of the mediator and the redeemer, time." This deification of time is parallel to Blake's conception of Los as both time and the Holy Spirit. To use a somewhat oversimplifying formula, the romantic time consciousness tends to be immanent rather than transcendent, and its emotional tone is not ecstatic so much as elegiac. The older ubi sunt theme of time as the devourer is of course still there, but it is qualified by occasional instance where our unconscious participation in larger rhythms of history and nature come to the surface and, quote, we feel that we are greater than we know. The Romantic poet, working as he normally does, without the professional rhetorical training that Spencer and Milton had, is well aware of the large involuntary element in creative writing. The times when the will to write must be employed to relax the will and let the slower autonomous rhythms welling up from lower strata of the mind take over. These rhythms are often identified with historical or natural processes, as in Prometheus Unbound, where the liberation of Prometheus is part of a huge cosmological culbute, in which Demogorgon ascends from the depths of the earth on a car piloted by the spirit of the hour to pull Jupiter off his throne. Shelley's vision is founded on the myth of resurrection, which is complementary to that of incarnation, though of course in Shelley it is not specifically the resurrection of Christ which is involved, as it is in Blake's America, for example. Both the rhythms of descent from above and emergence from below break into the continuity of our ordinary experience of time with something discontinuous. Elliott's quartets make a good deal of the discontinuity that the real present, the still point of the turning world, makes in time. Elliott shows us that it is folly to try to unify our linear sense of time, to assume that we get wiser as we get older, to think that we build a continuous structure of achievement out of our past that will follow us into the future. In the Dry Salvages, popular myths of evolution, progress, and fortune-telling are condemned as vanity as compared to the humility which sees in every moment a fresh beginning discontinuous with its predecessor. Quote, men's curiosity searches past and future and clings to that dimension. But to apprehend the point of intersection of the timeless with time is an occupation for the saint. And similarly, in Auden's For the Time Being, although the mythological framework is a romantic one, Herod's futile efforts to establish continuity and progress in his society turns a well-meaning liberal into an enemy of God. Well, time affects me as well as the Romantics and allows me only one suggestion to conclude with. In The Defense of Poetry, Shelley speaks of a polarizing in our awareness of time. On the one side is the perception of the environment as familiar and routine. And this corresponds in Shelley to demonic time, the sense that what is always going to happen must happen and should. The poetic or creative faculty pulls in the opposite direction. Its vision is always a renewal of the freshness and energy of man's view of nature. The next step is to realize that there are two powers in the consciousness, one analytic and the other synthetic, and that the latter is the poetic faculty properly speaking. Quote, reason respects the differences and imagination the similitudes of things. The poet constructs wholes which become in their turn part of the one great poem that all the poets in history have helped to construct. That is, the mythological universe, which is the model for the world man wants to live in, as distinct from the world that is there. Now, this separation of the reasoning from the creative faculty points to a curious paradox in the Romantic treatment of history. History qua history is the record of what actually occurred, and the reason, sifting evidence, plays a primary role in the awareness of history. Imagination, if it attends only to the similitudes of things, gets from the past not history but myth, the same thing that it gets from the future. For, according to Shelley, poets are, quote, the mirror of the gigantic shadows which futurity casts upon the present. I said that a specific historical consciousness is part of Romanticism, but this is really a sense of the mythical or unifying elements in history. Myth normally appears in the form of romance, when the genre employed is that of prose fiction. In the Romantic period, a good deal of fiction appeared under the category of historical novel, and we note that such historical novels are actually romances, in which whatever is historical is inserted as a kind of technical tour de force. The formulas of the Waverley novels are very close to the formulas of the late classical writers of the Second Sophistic, Heliodorus, Achilles Tatius, Longus, who also called their romances by such names as Ethiopica or Babyloniaca in order to claim some affinity with the historians. The same romance formulas reappear in contemporary science fiction, where the mythical shape is frequently projected on the future rather than the past. The writer of the period who really succeeds in giving us a sense of historical awareness is rather the writer who concentrates on the immediate data of sense experience and waking consciousness, in short, the compensatory form of romantic, whom we call the realist. By turning his back on history, the realist records the world in front of him, and in due course his picture of that world becomes something of a historical document. In the pastiche of Gibbon in Scott's Count Robert of Paris, or of Comines in Anne of Geierstein, there is little of much historical value, entertaining as these stories may be on other grounds. But in Mansfield Park, though of course the structure of comic romance is still there, the reflection of the life of the Regency period has a genuine historical importance. Later in the century, Oscar Wilde remarked in The Decay of Lying, which is really a manifesto of romantic and mythical writing as opposed to realism, quote, Monsieur Zola sits down to give us a picture of the Second Empire. Who cares for the Second Empire now? It is out of date. Life goes faster than realism, but romanticism is always in front of life. Put less polemically, we may say that of the two categories of this conference, romanticism deals with the recurring constants of myth and romance, historicism with the specific features of an age, normally the age contemporary with the writer, which are most successfully recorded by those who most successfully resist the temptations represented by the word romanticism.
Our second speaker is Professor Hartmann. He mentioned in his lecture yesterday afternoon that he would be pursuing at least one of the texts on the sheets which were distributed then. I'm not sure how many do not have them with them now. I'm not sure that we need worry about that. I am aware of a press at the door here. It might be possible to locate a few people down in the corners if you want to try that. Well, let's move on. It's a great pleasure to introduce Professor Hartmann to you again.
Whenever I listen to Professor Fry, I have the feeling, very agreeable, of being in a planetarium. And therefore, I have the perhaps natural anxiety at this moment in time that when you have finished listening to me, you may feel you have descended into what the 19th century called a curiosity shop. This is to say that notoriously I find it hard to take a position. And this is supposed to be, the chairman says, a position paper. And the way I have dealt with this problem is to latch on to a metaphor at the beginning and a metaphor at the end and extend myself between these metaphors. Now, my first metaphor is a venerable one, which I mentioned yesterday. It's that of the Theatrum Mundi, which Herder already used for his vision of historical time and its plenitude, its human plenitude. And so I consider myself standing now as the interpreter before you, in what is roughly defined as contemporaneity, and Professor Fay has already mentioned the difficulty of standing in time present, and I feel that the backdrop against which my words echo is clearly older and may be defined, for the sake of this conference at least, as a controversy between progressivist and anti-progressivist philosophies of history. The issue of historical progress is, as you know, left moot by Herder, who makes no ultimate distinction between culture and enlightenment, pointing out that both words are metaphors from different areas of experience, yet insisting in the Ideen zur Geschichte der Menschheit, yet insisting that some cultures are more enlightened than others, and anticipating, therefore, the vast Hegelian design of a movement from east to west, which does not end in decadence, but rather in a fulfillment of Humanität. The controversy is brought to sharper focus by first, and I really am very selective in terms of the history of ideas here, by first Kierkegaard's attacks on Hegel, with Kierkegaard making subtle and subversive use of the concept of repetition, and Professor Miller has already applied yesterday the concept of repetition to George Eliot. Then by Nietzsche's formulation of the concept of an eternal return, but also by Nietzsche's relentless critique of the notion that Weltgeschichte ist Weltgericht, a slogan which seems to go back to Schiller and perhaps went back to the very occasion in which we are informed by Professor Mink he was carried cheering on the cheering back of his students. You can imagine that if Weltgeschichte is Weltgericht, and if they are there at that moment and have been judged favorably, they have reason to be happy. Anyway, Nietzsche makes a merciless spoof of this kind of idea of providential history, which always ends in the present as being the justified present. As we enter our own century, we know the controversy best through an appreciation now general, because it started obviously at the beginning of the 19th century, of Vico's principle of ricorso, through such figures as Yeats and Spengler, who try to build the ricorso into their conjectural histories of the human spirit, through Popper's attack on Geistesgeschichte, that is the totalitarian or Hegelian version of historicism, and through Walter Benjamin's moving struggle to purify dialectical materialism of its progressivist or utopian bias, a struggle in which, for Benjamin, Nietzsche, but also Baudelaire, plays a crucial role. Den Weltlauf zu unterbrechen, das war der tiefste Wille in Baudelaire, to interrupt the course of the world. That was the deepest intention of Baudelaire. Yet what I personally contemplate as I stand under that vast philosophical sky which I've sketched, that backdrop which already seems somewhat unreal and scenic to us, is a set of purely formal problems, which, though distinctly literary, are also unreal. The reason for this further unreality is that these problems, being formal, cannot be made culture-specific or materially historical unless we already have a philosophy of history in mind with which, more forcibly than cogently, we associate them. These formal problems have to do with the conduct of narrative rather than with the conduct of world history, Weltlauf. And there, I think, I agree, of course, with Hayden White that they have to do with the conduct of narrative rather than with the conduct of world history. They deal with such literary features as digression and allusion, with such themes as the labyrinth, with such myths as the Orient as origin or the westward course of the spirit, with such questions of poetics as the mimetic dimension of character, point of view, persona, metaphor, and through all these, with the relevance of art to our function in time and history. that I hesitated before writing function, or function in time and history, rather than role or place or situation, that I chose the neutral or quasi-scientific word, says something about the intellectual bias of our time, which is against pathos. And the same bias makes one feel uneasy about such large verbal concepts as poetic self and time. Yet we cannot do without them any more than without historical speculation. Even in the purest philosophical discourse, there remains what Jacques Derrida has named a mythologie blanche. The inertia of language is part of the force of language and is a power to be reckoned with. Not everything in it is slag. And if artists like James Joyce complain of the language jam, this time jam yesterday, jam tomorrow, and also jam today. So while artists always complain of the language jam, they still exploit its facticity, its accidental sonorities, its etymological depth, its paradigmatic and syntagmatic dimensions. And in the same way, we cannot shrug off the inertial force of historical poetics. We are stuck for a time with such terms as self and time. And the relatively slow rate of change in our own conceptual system, what we have called its inertial force, actually furnishes us with constants of a remarkable degree of universality. Take, for example, the notion of self as it emerges from the retarding, inertial concept of character, which I mentioned yesterday. Consider that Wordsworth, one of the poets in whom the term self emerges as distinct from character, and who had his difficulty with that historically transmitted notion, is also the one who founded the character of the poet. I am using the subtitle, maybe even the title, of a recent psychoanalytic study of Wordsworth by Honorato. That is, who claimed for the poet a special sensibility, independent of class or social circumstance, indeed, a great birthright, as he calls it, which lodges in all as an infant sensibility, but is unfortunately not developed in all, but repressed or broken off. Then apply this conceptual disharmony between self and character to the Boy of Winander episode, which images a break in self-development. Some of you know that in the original version of the Boy of Winander episode, the boy was clearly identified as I, and Wordsworth changes it later to the third person. Then apply this conceptual disharmony between self and character to the Boy of Winander episode, which images a break in self-development by evoking a great divide with the boy on one side and the man on the other. There is no easy progression. The structure, in fact, is that of an interrupted pastoral. And it is impossible to say where the poetic self lodges, whether in the dead boy, is that where poetry, the poetic self is, or in the living, meditative man conscious of mortality, but that already somehow seems beyond poetry into what we roughly call philosophy. The two parts don't fit together, the two parts of the poem. Despite the progressivist argument of the prelude into which this fragment was incorporated, a poem, the prelude, subtitled, as you may know, The Growth of a Poet's Mind. Dust as we are, the immortal spirit grows like harmony in music, Wordsworth exclaims near the beginning of his memorials. But what one is constantly made to feel is the precariousness of the harmony, of this self-building spirit which the Victorian poets, developing the musical analogy and not uninfluenced by the German idea of Bildung, later consolidated into doctrine. When Keats writes, a poet has no identity, he means the same as a poet has no character. That is, his self-image is perpetually dissolved by the dream element or the self-emptying power of empathy in him. It is proper to recall here Pope's wittily sexist observation that women have no character at all. That is the curse or odium weighing on the line going from Wordsworth to Keats. The modern poets, of course, aided by the findings of mythologists and psychoanalysts, will become aggressively insistent that the feminine or Marian or matriarchal element has been repressed. Indeed, Michelet is a poet in that sense, and must be reintegrated into human culture. Blake will now be rediscovered and simplified in this light. But though Tennyson, Swinburne, and Hopkins are on the horizon, Yeats's vision, with its stylized historical gyration of self and anti-self, which subsumes the sexual characteristics, is still a century away. Since we are in a kind of theater, and have already traveled forward to Yeats, let me invite you now to turn back 2 centuries or more to Milton, to one of the really magical moments in literature, not uninspired by theater and masque, for it presents a transformation scene, such as changed on the stage a poor man's hut into a palace, or hell into paradise, or vice versa. I allude to the ending of the first book of Paradise Lost, in which, as you may remember, Satan's pompous host assembled in pandemonium is changed before our eyes into a fairy circle, which a belated peasant sees or dreams he sees in the moonlight. Formally considered, this sequence is an elaborate digression from the apparent line of action. It creates in the narrative not only a moment of rich, conspicuous, even irrelevant foregrounding of the poetical texture, but also a ghostly dimensional shift from action to observation, one which slows the narrative flow even as it quickens the reader's mind by the sounded wealth of allusions. Here then is a strange turn or troping or deviousness, whatever one wishes to call it. The result, in any case, is that all kinds of time feelings re-enter, which had been allayed by the regular, even triumphant course of the narrative. If we take stock during this ghostly pause of the illusions imposed on us by the author, we realize that even an inobvious phrase can prove to be enchanted ground. Exploring the literary etymology of the peasant who sees or dreams he sees, a phrase which thematizes, however passingly, the illusionist atmosphere of the entire epic, we are whisked back 17 centuries to a glimpse of Virgil's Dido, because that exact phrase is used by Virgil when Aeneas sees Dido in hell. We are whisked back 17 centuries to a glimpse of Virgil's Dido, seen through the surprised yet uncertain eyes of a guilty Aeneas, and in a moonlight. Remember, the peasant sees all this in a moonlight, not unsimilar to that which illuminated her first appearance in Virgil's epic in Book 1. So time, the literary historical time separating Virgil and Milton, as well as the mortal time in which Aeneas has to sacrifice Dido, becomes at once curiously weightless and decisive, innocent and guilty. The moon itself, of course, that changeable mother of the month, is a time symbol, and the moon is overhead. While even the temporal dimension of genre is evoked, if we recall that pastoral, and at the end of Paradise Lost we are not in epic, strictly considered, but in pastoral, if we recall that pastoral, as Puttenham noted, displays a prophetic reserve by glancing at greater things under the semblance of lesser. The most interesting feature, however, in this transformation scene is the figure of the peasant. A pastoral needs a peasant. In that respect, his appearance is innocent. But the recursive pattern of the formal transformation in that sequence at the end of Paradise Lost places the peasant in a spot previously occupied by Satan, Soldan, Sun and Taurus, Moon and implicitly Aeneas. The only thematic link between these oddly consorted observers is possibly that of labor, human activity, in its precarious relation to grace. In the light of the laboring moon, we understand, perhaps, that the peasant too is a laborer, that his harvest is as uncertain as that of Virgil's Agricola in the Georgics, or as that of Mammon Mulciper, whose high towers and engines, mentioned only a few lines before this episode, availed him nothing. Indeed, it is Mulciper's high towers and engines, in another sense, built in hell now rather than heaven, that are being transformed even now into this unpretentious moment by the mirabile dictu of Milton. But this artisanal magic evokes in turn, at the end of the first book of the epic, the figure of the artist as laborer and his relation to grace. It is, after all, the artist's engines which are at work here, ransacking pagan literature for illusions or treasures better hid. Will there be grace for his work, for the precious bane of his epic? Can the justifier be justified? We return thus to the central issue of the character of the poet in a Puritan age or any age. Wozu Dichter in dürftiger Zeit? Now, a poet in search of a theme and so of his poetic identity is how the prelude opens. The Miltonic brooding has become overt, but directs itself now at inactivity and vacillation, as Wordsworth fears he is a false steward who hath much received and renders nothing back. And I want you to recall what happens at the beginning of the prelude. Was it for this, Wordsworth asks, that Derwent sent a voice flowing along his dreams even in infancy, that the winding river, winding is his own adjective, like the immortal mother of a mortal hero, that's my addition, began to manifest that the winding river, like the immortal mother of a mortal hero, began to manifest Wordsworth's destiny. The boy of Winander is also river or lake born, and how winding the hero's fate may be is quietly conveyed by the flow of Wordsworth's episode. It suggests not only the wandering steps and slow, and I'm talking about the whole structure of it, but especially the second paragraph. It suggests not only the wandering steps and slow of belated post-Edenic man, but also how broken or devious the path is, the path of life, that leads from the marvelous boy depicted in the first paragraph to the mature person of the second, the fully cultivated poet. We are presented both with the image of a split self, boy on one side of the divide, man on the other, and that of a split sound, a curiously awkward syntax. And for the curiously awkward syntax, we could engage in an analysis of the second paragraph of the episode. We won't. For in Wordsworth, it is always a sound or a voice that must grow with thought, as well as a person. As if when the voice broke, identity itself were in danger of breaking. If you have the poem, just one direct reference to it, there is a break after there was a boy. In your version, that break is just a comma, and then there's an apostrophe that interrupts. In the 1805 version, 5 years later, that break is actually made more graphic by a hyphen. So the break or hyphen after there was a boy is eloquent. And both Lucy and Matthew poems are characterized by cries or fits of speech which leave an echoing hiatus in the mind. Really, the poem is all in there was a boy, hyphen. It could have stopped there. The role of that split or doubling sound we call an echo is as important to Wordsworth as reflection and after image. And now, having said the poem could have stopped there, I of course go on to give you a very short structural analysis of the sound element in the poem. Wordsworth's experiences tend to divide into an event and its repercussions. Think of the Daffodil poem or think of the Solitary Reaper. There's always an event and there are certain repercussions which spread out. The one act characterizing, the event as it were, characterizing the boy of Winander is that he makes nature, its hidden life, respond. He makes it echo. The reflective man standing over the boy's grave, does he not do a similar thing? For the logic as a whole, imposes the thought that he, just like the boy, is calling a voice out of silence. Do we not find ourselves here before a tragic ode to echo? For the boy's first trial of the voice, his hallooing, raises not just echoes, but uncontrollable echoes, while nature's indirect or imperceptible action, which is related later, moves so quickly inward that it too is uncontrollable. It overwhelms him, it drowns him. If you take the metaphor of the bosom of the steady lake, you shouldn't take it literally, but if you just allow it a certain literal moment in your mind, there is either no response or too much of it. The poet's muteness expresses in this context, the muteness depicted in the second paragraph, a crying too inward for tears. We're still crying, but this is not an express cry. It's a cry too deep, too inward for tears. That is to say, for such tears of the muses as echoing streams, hills, rocks, or similar pastoral and elegiac tropes. And you see why Wordsworth always wants to get beyond the trope, beyond the figure of speech, to something more inward. I have called this echo structure a tragic one, because echo and after-image are progressively internalized until the possibility of response is buried on the bourne from which no traveler returns. So deeply, if providentially split, are childhood and manhood, or poetic self and character. It is hard to conceive them as dwelling in one person, still in touch with each other, mutually echoing, mutually responsive. Hence, when Wordsworth says in the poem before you, "A full half hour together I have stood," a full half hour together I have stood, one is tempted to detach together from half hour and read it with "I have stood." The I in this mute reflection has gathered to itself a remembered mode of being and stood together in unity for a space of time, half hour, which significantly divides time to make us aware of it. Wordsworth is relatively free of that kind of echo we call a literary allusion. Yet no poet who reads so easily at first puts as heavy a burden on the reader. And you see my technique now. I want to get from the phenomenology of echo to the phenomenology of literary allusion here. This burden he puts on the reader is again that of responsiveness, of echoing in oneself a verse which is non-elusive and must therefore be developed by personal extension, by a kind of de te fabula narratur. The echo structure continues itself until we feel a relation between Wordsworth looking mutely at the boy of Winander's grave and the stranger or traveler, that is, reader on the horizon, who will ponder this verse, the poet's inscription. Time stretches through this reader, who's purely on the theoretical horizon of the verse. Time stretches through this reader into a potentially infinite series of echoes. It is the reader who makes the verse responsive, however inward or buried it sounds. He also calls a voice out of silence, alone or as part of a family, which includes Dorothy and Coleridge. Remember, the whole of the prelude is addressed to Coleridge. Remember the sudden psychogenesis, as it were, of Dorothy at the end of Tintern Abbey. So the reader, alone or as part of a family which includes Dorothy and Coleridge, redeems the poet's voice from solitariness. In the ultimate pastoral, voice remains ghostly until it makes even the mute rock respond. And I quote here from an early poem, an early fragment in which Wordsworth says, "All things shall speak of man." Five more minutes. Such a transformation, of course, of this into the ultimate pastoral, where all things speak of man, is never shown by Wordsworth. There is no Miltonic resounding grace, no ultimate pastoral. The path that leads in The Boy of Winander, from invocation to echo to mute reflection, is the only one. The path is not lost to us, because, however inward, it remains temporal, and so may be recalled through the turnings intricate of verse. This power of recall, as the prelude shows, is no simple imitation, but a creative response, a new venture which extends and renews time. But I see I have slipped from my initial metaphor of the theater of life to that of the path, of path-finding and culture in its link to cultivation. Through such experiences, as he portrayed in the first part of the Boy of Winander episode, images Wordsworth wrote are, I quote, planted in the mind for immortality. A somewhat sinister comment, this, considering the early demise of the young man. We are left with a sense of disjunction in personal development, curiously similar to that which Wordsworth felt had overtaken history, the historical flow of time, with the French Revolution, and perceived by him as tempting the thinkers of his day with a para-apocalyptic idea that there was a radical gulf or schism between past and future. Think again of the Boy of Winander episode, with the boy, nothing, then the man. A radical gulf or schism between past and future, ancien régime and the new politics, the old Adam and the new. This threatened the French Revolution and the conclusions drawn by thinkers from it. This threatened to undo the lesson of the English Revolution of the 17th century, which had maintained legal forms and imaged itself in the prevailing British ideology as a reform movement, essentially. Wordsworth's radicalism was displaced, as it were, into poetry by taking literally the concept of culture as cultivation, returning to a ground out of which things grew and ripened slowly, precariously. And Professor Fry was talking about that unconscious will, which tempered the haste of time. Where accident was important, some people grew, some didn't. And where there was, for humanity or humanität, generically considered, an infinite chance for birth and rebirth. The literalism of Wordsworth's metaphors, fair seed time had my soul. You remember, and I grew up fostered alike by beauty and by fear. The literalism of such phrases shocks us into a view of culture which is indeed more than overlay and violence against nature. But in the Boy of Winander episode, the metaphor of this benevolent nature, this nature which is also culture, breaks and reveals what it never intended to hide, the circuitous journey, as Mike Abrams has called it, or the eccentric path leading from nature through culture to a human harvest. Thank you.
I'm not sure that I accept the image of the curiosity shop. I'm not sure Professor Fry would accept the image of the planetarium. But I like the theater, and I think the path will also do. I suppose, in fact, the question arises immediately as to just what our role up here, or should I say function, following Professor Hartmann's terminology, ought to be. And I'm sure that's a question that really should be put to our commentators, whether they would want to respond or not. Professor Abrams is known to all of you, I'm sure, from his books on Romanticism. He is also known to many of us by sight because he was, I think, one of the only people yesterday who chose to identify himself by name for the tapes. I would like to say that I'm very pleased that he was able to join us for this colloquium. He is on his own path, circuitous, in fact, from Ithaca to England, stopping on the way in Toronto. I will turn the floor over to you, Professor Abrams, at this point, if I may.
It'll be no news to those who heard the plaintive comments of the commentators yesterday that these papers were just as much news to the commentators today as they are to you. They came on me with a fine suddenness. That's Keats's phrase, of course, and he's talking not about expository prose, but about poetry. And the chairman has confronted us with the problem of what to say, given such a situation. Well, what occurs to me to do is this. It's been remarked that I had the intrepidity to follow the behest of the chairman yesterday and say who I was. I was even more intrepid, it turned out, in mentioning the name of Wittgenstein. Some people publicly and some afterward privately said that this name invariably caused them to horripilate. So I can't resist the temptation to raise hackles again to pick up Nari Fry's lead and talk about his talking about time by reference to Augustine, because some of you may know that Wittgenstein's philosophical investigations begin by his referring, or right near the beginning, to Augustine on time as opening up his investigations. Now, Wittgenstein revered Augustine, and he said, for example, that anything Augustine says he'd hesitate to call false because of his tremendous respect for him as a philosopher. But what he does is quote Augustine saying that he uses the word time and has no problems about it at all until he asks himself, what is time? And then he is deeply immersed in the sea of doubt as to what it is, to which Wittgenstein's reply, to put it in its crudest terms, is he should never have asked the question. You should never ask the question, what is time? Instead, your policy should be to look and see how time is used in actual English sentences in a variety of sentences and in a variety of contexts. Well, the fact is that poets, like metaphysicians, have always talked about time and have always faced, directly or indirectly, the question, what is time? And they have given such queer answers as those that Professor Fry has represented to us. And of course, there's no expectation that poets will give up the use of the words in these strange ways. There's little hope that metaphysicians will either, despite Wittgenstein's advice. Certainly literary critics who deal both with poets and literary historians too, deal with poets and metaphysicians and all the queer tribe of people who talk about time. They can't afford to stop talking about time. What I want to do is, I don't want to take too much time here, because the experience yesterday showed that the conversation doesn't really get vigorous until we open the thing up to comments and questions from the floor. But I thought what I might try to do is take a slightly different perspective on what Professor Fry has said, one that I don't think he would disagree with, just another way of looking at the thing, that might tie in a little bit, too, with what some of the people said yesterday when they talked about plot narrative and what you do with time as an essential ingredient of what we call history. If you, if you go back to the Bible and its exegetes, you find that they thought of history as indeed having a plot that evolved through time. And there was no problem then about thinking of history as having a plot, because, of course, history had an author. And that author had planned it all from the beginning in his timeless view of everything simultaneously, and foresaw the end. And that plot was often described by people as a circuitous one, out of and back at the end of time to a restored Eden. The Romantics, who, as Mr. Fink pointed out yesterday, the philosophers of the 18th century, rather, who talked in terms of Universalgeschichte, universal history, undertook for the most part to maintain the view that the history was a narrative and had a plot which was not imposed on it by historians, but was in the course of things for historians to discover and expound. They undertook to salvage, the whole romantic dealing with human culture can be looked at as an immense salvage operation. The sense that the grounding of Western culture and all its values and all its ways, its concepts, major concepts and so on, which had been the grounding of this, which had hitherto been in a creator and a providential author and controller, with that assurance diminishing, and in some writers having disappeared entirely, problem was to save culture. And that problem was quite clearly faced by a number of the commentators. As such, they didn't wander into this way of operation. They knew what they were doing, and they knew how great was the emergency of culture with which they were faced. And one of the salvage operations was involved towards saving the notion that history had a plot, even though they were far less certain, many of them, that there was an author of the plot. And the writers of universal history, the history of mankind as a whole, told as a single story, in which the hero, the protagonist, is called everyman or some synonym of everyman, Menschheit and so on. The writers of providential history in the latter 18th century, at any rate, were almost unanimous in recognizing and accounting for the fact that they took over into the narrative of history. Motion change through time and history took over the biblical story with its ready-made plot. And they showed they recognized this by again and again beginning with the book of Genesis and showing that their account of universal history was a rendering into rational and conceptual terms of the truth which the writers or Moses or whoever had written the first book of the Bible had told in mythical terms. Schelling makes that claim very explicitly in his master's dissertation with which his philosophy began. Schiller made it in an academic dissertation. Hegel made it. Kant made it in his writings on universal history. To what extent with tongue-in-cheek isn't clear. I think the others were not writing with tongue-in-cheek. You find the same thing indicated in Lessing and all the other great writers of universal history. So they very well knew that they were taking over a ready-made plot, but were trying to account for the great role of human events. They tried to give it a secular basis. Now, in the Romantic view of the course of an individual life and a human life in time, the attempt, too, was made to salvage the ancient Hebrew and Christian notions of time and redemption from time. And I'll just mention two clear cases, the latter of which will get a little bit into what Mr. Hartmann said. Of course, the redemption from time, the redemption in time from time, the end in the return to Eden, which is the Romantics almost unanimously, accepting certain clues in the older writers, thought of as a higher Eden, the Eden of organized innocence rather than mere blank innocence in Blake's terms. The ultimate Eden to which we return is a higher Eden than that from which we were excluded by the angel with his flaming sword. But they retained the notion of a return to the lost golden place from which we started, but on a higher level, because all our experience, suffering, sin, and all the rest in between, is not lost, but organized in that vision of eternity which marks one's return home as the place which is then recognized for the first time, as Elliott and many, many others before Elliott had put that notion. So the redemption from time is retained by Romantics, but given through explanations of growth, maturity, and so on, given a secular base which was thought to eliminate the need of an authorial plot. Even more interestingly is their attempt to salvage the notion of an incursion of eternity in time, which can occur in the course of an individual's life and which marks poetry's highest moments. And the word moment is the word most frequently used for that. It's the Romantics, almost every major Romantic poetry talks about in prose and also writes or expresses in verse the incursion of eternity in time. In Blick eines Nu, as Goethe put it, in the flash of an hour, where the momentary becomes eternal and yet remains an eternal moment in the inescapable vicissitude, change, passage of time in this life. Wordsworth's Spots of Time are one example of that. You can, of course, look at the experience of the boy of Winander here as a spot of time, an incursion of an eternal moment in time. Wordsworth describes that kind of thing in the Prelude, sometimes very explicitly. When Wordsworth is passing the threshold of London, the threshold from youth into his mature knowledge of good and evil in the city of London, he says, it was but a moment, but with time, he repeats that word one, but with time it dwells as a thing divine. It's a clear recognition, I think, of where this kind of thing comes from. Now, what we find in poets now is no intention whatever to give up that moment. Poets of the present are great poets of that moment of the incursion of eternity into time. The model for that, by the way, among the commentators on it before the Romantic period, the great archetypal incursion of eternity into time was the incarnation of Christ. But what you get in a poet like Wallace Stevens is a dropping of the utopian future, the millennial, chiliastic, or whatnot apocalypse, which has become an apocalypse, secular apocalypse of the secular imagination in the Romantic poets, but an even greater insistence on the saving moment within the passage of time, where saving too becomes a metaphor taken from theology and used secularly. Sylvia Plath, many other non-theistic poets, anti-theistic poets, insist on the saving moment, which Joyce calls epiphany. Well, I don't find anything to fight with in what's been said here. I'm not sure I agree with everything that's been said, but I hesitate to disagree, because where I'm least certain that I agree, I'm least certain that I'm sure what the speakers have said. So I'm sure Mr. Dickstein has understood better, and I'll leave him to take the baton.
Well, I also hesitate to violate the poesy of the two position papers by commenting on them. Really, all that I knew in advance was Jeffrey Hartmann telling me that he would talk about Wordsworth, which was no great surprise to me. Because wherever Hartmann is, Wordsworth is really far behind. And
About some other things too.
no. But so I thought that what I might do profitably would be to make a few comments on time and Wordsworth, because I think Wordsworth is the perfect example of the poet for whom time is central, and central in a romantic way. One of the ways in which at this conference we've frequently been talking about Romanticism, and one of the ways that one always talks about Romanticism is in terms of a break, some kind of break in the history of culture and the history of form and the history of art and so on. And I think in thinking about the romantic sense of time, we often do it in those terms. I think Professor Fry has suggested that before the Romantics, time is more transcendent in the Romantics, time is more immanent, time in the Romantics tends to be elegiac, and so on. I think that tendency of seeing things in terms of a before and an after, in terms of a sharp break and a kind of drastic incursion of the modern, of the new, of the existential, is in fact an illustration of the extent to which we are all still under the sway of romantic modes of thinking. Because I think that although we have the precedent in and of course the notion of the fall, which nevertheless the fall is not really something that takes place in time. The fall is something in Christian theology that marks every human being. It's a kind of separation, not really a spatial separation, but a kind of ontological separation between the human situation and that divine world of time and being that we can approximate, as Professor Fry suggested, in moments of exuberance in which time becomes, in a Blakean sense, in a sense, the rhythm of our most intense and vital being, but which we never reach in that manner. We simply this gives us a moment of which gives us an intuition of what true time or ideal time would be. I think Professor Abrams has talked about this idea of the saving moment. In thinking about how to approach this question of time, I look back and reread some of Georges Poulet's book, Studies in Human Time, and he tends to schematize things in his opening chapter in terms of centuries. He sees the beginnings of this break that I've mentioned in the secularization in the 16th to the 17th century, in which in the 17th century he sees as a moment of really of anxiety and the separation of anxiety, the separation of man from this, the kind of secure theological perspective. And you get it in Montaigne, the famous beginning of the essay on repentance, in which he talks about everything is always changing and so on. The 18th century, Poulet sees as in a sense, as a definitive ratification of that separation between the human and divine time. And in the 18th century, he describes men giving themselves up to the sensation of the moment. He describes the kind of picaresque and a kind of adventurous and particularistic sort of element in 18th century fiction and poetry, satire. But I think that when Poulet gets to the 19th century, I think his interpretation becomes more controversial. That he sees the Romantics not as the creatures who are first really most intensely experiencing this existential or ontological or epistemological break, but as in fact the Romantics are those who are trying to recover from it. That they have these intimations of this sort of lost plenitude of being, which in these saving moments, in these magical moments, and their aim is to recapture a kind of fullness and totality of being. It's an impossible aim, but he sees this positive goal as the essence of the romantic impulse. Now, so on the one hand, we have I think the more conventional interpretation of Romanticism, that Romanticism is about loss. It's about it's essentially elegiac. On the other hand, Poulet suggests that Romanticism is basically built up out of this positive movement towards recapturing an equivalent of the older sense of fullness and security in time. Now, in Wordsworth, we have a very central focus on this in a way that neither approximates the elegiac view of time, nor really approximates the notion of the kind of the utopian view of time. And you get a tremendous sense of the passage of time in Wordsworth. To think of the opening of Tintern Abbey, I mean, the very syllables of the opening lines of Tintern Abbey: 5 years have passed, 5 summers, and the length of 5 long winters. I mean, every syllable has got to be stressed and heavy and long. And in a line and a half, you feel that time has passed. And nevertheless, depicting the passage of time is not the point of Tintern Abbey. The point of Tintern Abbey is, in a way, approximates the apologetic, the title of this panel, for which our chairman has needlessly apologized. I think that the sense of time in Tintern Abbey is that time becomes the measure of the creation of both of the self, and particularly of the poetic self in the poem. That, as we all know, that Wordsworth uses what in the Prelude he calls his two consciousnesses, where he talks about being, looking back to his past, he seems to be two consciousnesses, conscious of himself and of some other being. He uses that in little in a poem like Tintern Abbey to try and define who he was and who he has become. And particularly, the important thing about that poem is that it doesn't simply reach back elegiacally to mourn the loss of childhood, but reaches forward tragically, or almost tragically, toward full of intimations of death, and the separation from the child that he was becomes a foreshadowing of separation from his sister, separation from the landscape, separation from life itself. But also, there's something else that's happening in the poem, and that he talks, for example, of this moment of looking at the landscape is not simply a moment in which he feels the weight of the past, but it's going to give him food for future time. It's going to give him. He reaches forward, and this will be a moment in which he'll be able to use in precisely the same way that he uses his previous visit to Tintern Abbey or to the banks of the Wye, in some future time it will become internalized, it will become part of the resources of his inner being. Essentially, what he seems to be doing to that landscape on the banks of the Wye is that he's turning space into time. He's turning space into something that will be part of the inner rhythms of his being. He does this in a very easy and schematic way. For example, in I Wandered Lonely as a Cloud, which, like many of his other poems, begins in the past and then talks about how only his inner being can capture the landscape as something that will be part of his lived experience for the future. It's only when the image of the daffodils flashes upon the inward eye, which is the bliss of solitude, and then my heart with pleasure fills and dances with the daffodils. And this is the kind of dance, the dance of being that Professor Fry alluded to in the orchestra. What Wordsworth seems to be doing here, as in so many other poems, is both weighing and feeling very intensely the sense of time, the effect of time, the ravages of time upon man and the poet, who no longer has the myths of redemption and resurrection as a kind of active daily sustenance. But at the same time, the main aim of Wordsworth seems not to sort of depict the tragedy of man in a world after the death of God, or a man in a world in which time is only human and only a devolution towards death, but to provide what everyone else later in the 19th century, though we seem to have forgotten this about Wordsworth, considered the greatest myth of consolation in English poetry of that century. The essential movement, it seems to me, of Tintern Abbey and of all the other poems of Wordsworth is to count up elegically the losses and the ravages of time, but then to say no. There's always abundant recompense, and the abundant recompense is a myth either that the passage of time has its redemptive element, and that growing up into maturity and so on is itself part of the seriousness and weight of the human condition, part of being really alive, but also providing some kind of consolation in the kinds of beings that Professor Hartmann mentioned in his lecture yesterday. The Danish boy, Lucy, all of these creatures who, like the spots of time, are in a sense exempted from time. You think of those two high points in Tintern Abbey where Wordsworth is laid asleep in body and becomes a living soul, a moment when time seems to stop, and that moment will become capital for future years of inner time. They'll become a kind of capital that will enable Wordsworth to deal with the dins of towns and cities, with the greetings where no kindness is, and so on. That Wordsworth, in the same way that, for example, the death of Lucy provides for Wordsworth both a sense of loss, which he must bear in the process of sort of tragically becoming human, but at the same time an image of an exemption from time. That Lucy is someone who did not grow up, who died into nature. 3 years she grew in sun and shower. Nature decided to take her to her own, and by taking her to her own, nature, she gives Lucy a kind of wonderfully non-tragic parody of the process of growth. That Lucy is someone in vital feelings of delight. Shall rear her form to stately height, her virgin bosom dwell. She'll always remain a virgin. She'll have a growing up, which is a growing up into nature rather than a growing up into the kind of tragic sense of time that Wordsworth himself experiences. And Wordsworth has this attraction to the exemption from time that Lucy represents, or that Lucy Gray represents. And she is a living child, and so on. And hers shall be the breathing balm, and hers the silence and the calm of mute, insensate things. Wordsworth himself feels a tremendous attraction to becoming a kind of mute, insensate thing, to becoming rocks and stones and trees, to being exempt from the very forces of devolution and time and change, which the ultimate effect of the poem, however, is to insist upon and to ratify. That Wordsworth himself never opts out, never pretends to become the Lucy, never pretends to become the leech gatherer, but simply uses a figure like the leech gatherer as representing for him the myth, the notion that time can do your worst, time can do its worst, as it has done to the leech gatherer, who's all bent up and become a kind of circle. Time and the leech gatherer becomes a sort of semi-divine apparition that will become part of Wordsworth's inner life and will be a consolation for the pains of the human condition and the ravages of human time. I think that this is what the later part of the century saw in Wordsworth, and this is why they paid those extraordinary tributes to Wordsworth that we get, for example, in John Stuart Mill's autobiography, or in Arnold's memorial verses on the death of Wordsworth, in which he says he lay us on the flowery lap of earth and so on. Who could teach us how to feel as Wordsworth taught us how to feel? That Wordsworth gave us back the possibility of a kind of rich and full inner life, despite the fact that our awareness of the pains and burdens of being human in a purely human world had left us bereft and orphaned. I think that what happens later in the century, the kind of late or decadent phase of Romanticism, the post-Arnoldian phase of Romanticism, is when poets could no longer believe in the Wordsworthian consolation, and they returned, in a sense, to what Poulet describes as the 18th century solution, the giving oneself up entirely to the moment, the idea that we all are sitting on the volcano, on the apocalypse, and the only thing is to, in Pater's sense, to live all you can, to live as fully and intensely in every single moment as possible, because there is that the myth that Wordsworth creates in Tintern Abbey, that the poet himself, in writing the poem, can create a semi-sacred bond of continuity between past and present and future, can stand as a worshipper on the banks of the stream and give both himself and his sister, and I think many of the thinking and feeling men of the later part of the century, some hope for consolation from time, that myth was, by the end of the century, definitively dead.
I sense the panel as being dangerously close to some suspension of controversy. And I look to the audience to deflate any confidence or sense of finality that might have emerged from presentation. I'm even prepared to let us go over the hour, should you choose to carry us there, since I doubt we'll be able to get these gentlemen together again too easily, too soon, so that I look forward to fielding questions as the hands go up. But perhaps I should first ask whether those who presented papers have any response to the commentaries they'd like to make.
I think there should be disruption.
I think I've got lots I could say, but I would much rather see it open to the floor at this point, I think.
Well. Yes.
Could I raise a point, just a small point of exegesis about the boy of Winander? It's suggested that the relationship is that of echoing, but in fact what the boy is doing is...
Professor Cameron carefully did not use his pipe. If he really used his pipe, it would be a pastoral image. And we might have heard echoes. I think the point was not that the doing it through his hand was the echoing, but that he finally did get a response from the owls. Yes, that was the point. His action is not in itself, of course, the echo.
No, I'm sorry, I thought you were suggesting that the owl's replying is an echo, but in fact, surely this is a response.
there is a distinction to be made between echo and response. I agree. I think we could ponder that. It is just curious that if you put these on a not on a level but on a spectrum, you get a whole series of terms which are structurally significant: resonance, echo. Response is right at the other end, and you might claim there's a discontinuity in the semantic field, and I would be guilty of putting them close together, because I think in fact they have become associated in Wordsworth. But it is good to point out that there is, after all, a difference between echo, resonance, and repercussion is another word I used, and response. If you remember the last stanza of the solitary reaper, the music in my heart I bore long after it was heard no more, there's that same strange, buried internalization, which is the phenomenon, in a sense, I'm getting at, although the terms, I have no term that can build that bridge, and indeed I would insist that there's still a discontinuity, which you have well pointed out.
Of course, the responses of the owls, specifically echo and re-echo.
The responses of the owls, by the way, double and redouble. So you could, all I'm saying is that, as a matter of fact, in an earlier episode in Book 1, you have the glad animal shouts, and it's important that these are animal voices. These are not human voices, in a sense. The voices of the children ice skating are treated almost like the voices of animal spirited beings, and the far mountains echo them. So I think there's enough of a spectrumal continuity to make the point probable.
Professor White. Yes, I'd like to ask a question to the panel in general, and try to tie up the discussion of time and the poetic self with the more general question of the historical sense of Romanticism. And I'd like to do it by assuming a Marxist perspective, which I think has been lacking in the discussion so far. And I was put in mind of this by the kind of offensive and self-indulgent egotism of Wordsworth. I mean, as described very, very beautifully by both Jeffrey and Mr. Dickstein. The problem is this: the poet who is going to redeem us from either the sense of loss, the consolations of myth, which are now behind us, who assumes an elegiac tone, who presumes, however, to be the organ, musical organ, through which eternity expresses itself. What I want to know is this. We talked about the rhythm of nature, the rhythm of the cosmos, the rhythm of the poetic self. Is there in Romanticism in general, and this is where it ties in with an historical sense, because history is about the way people organize themselves to work. History is quintessentially that. It's not about nature, and it's not about the cosmos. It's about the way people organize themselves to do their work first. Now, is there a characteristic rhythm that you find, and here I think Professor Fry touched on it in his remarks on Shelley, is there a characteristic rhythm of social time imaginable by any early Romantic poet? Does the social world, does the world of praxis itself have its own imaginable rhythm of which the poet might be the expression, the incarnation, or the custodian of? You follow the question? I wish would the panel in general comment on that? Because this may be what's wrong with Romanticism as an historical point of view.
It's wrong with Romanticism, and we've given you a very wrong idea of what we were talking about, Hayden. You would have to make your case by saying what kind of rhythm of work does Homer give us, Maybe you're thinking of ideas of the folk ballad as being sung while people know music while you work. Now it's in what? I think there are lots of theoretical and methodological problems which are raised by your comment. I suppose that there must be at some point a workable path from the expressiveness and self-expressiveness, not necessarily selfish self-expressiveness of the poet, to the question what work poetry does. I try to suggest that this question is raised by the poet himself, whether it's Milton or Keats. What kind of imaginative labor is poetry? The accusation that it is antisocial or that it is dream and so on simply puts the question back to us: why do we dream? What vital function is served by the awake dreaming that poetry is? And it's perhaps not entirely satisfactory to say, but the poet is a great organizer. He exhibits organic form. He uses materials. That kind of analogy is perhaps not satisfactory. In fact, there is a dangerous discontinuity between the expressive, dulce, perhaps, and utilitarian functions of poetry. What I'm saying is that you cannot ascribe the lack of an easy connection to the Romantics. You would have to raise the question about surely most modes of literature. If you're willing to raise it of all modes of literature, or almost all modes of literature, then I'm prepared to answer.
Yourself yesterday in your contrast of the between
The demonic and
Goethe to Wordsworth,
right,
in their attitude towards the demonic itself,
that's true,
as regenerative, as constructive, and so on.
But I was looking at from the kind of scruple, from the apologetics that each poet has to make for himself, because he is a human being under the pressure of the equivalent of Marxism in his era. No, I don't in any way mean to evade the question. I will give others a chance to reply. I just wish that you would generalize the question and not make it appear that Romanticism is vulnerable to this. So that's all I want to say at the beginning. But the question is there.
I would add simply a footnote to that and say I think you have to distinguish. I think that you're still a little bit outraged by Michelet's description of the historian and have applied that illicitly to Wordsworth's sense of himself as a poet. I think that you get some of that. You get some of that in Romantic ideology. I think you have to separate Romantic polemic, really, from Romantic poetry. And Romantic polemic with the poet as the unacknowledged legislator of the world, or even sometimes Romantic polemic in verse, something like Wordsworth's Prospectus to the Recluse, where he also presents an extremely elevated image of the poet and so on. And that's very different however, from what is happening in Tintern Abbey. In Tintern Abbey, there's no self-inflation in terms of the role of the poet. That the salvational myth that I was talking about is not something that Wordsworth himself really propagates, but something that other people were able to use, finding it in Wordsworth. Wordsworth is confronting in Tintern Abbey, is confronting one of his sense of his own mortality, a sudden incursion of a feeling of his own, of the passage of time, and the sense of his own mortality. And the fact that Wordsworth found a personal consolation for his own feelings of mortality in that poem was found to be of use by other men in reading the poem. I think that essentially this is the function that the Romantic poet has, that he is trying to present, as in a sense all writers are trying to present, an image of a kind of fully lived, a fully imagined being. And insofar, and one way of looking at it from a Marxian point of view would be to say that represents, that represents precisely the kind of image of fullness of being that Marx would describe as unalienated existence in an unalienated society, but that Marx describes it in terms of a transition from an alienated to an unalienated world, and the poet simply enacts it by being true to his own experience.
Don't you think poetry is unalienated labor?
No.
All right, history writing.
No.
Yeah, just a very brief footnote to the footnote. To talk about Wordsworth as redeeming life, redeeming time, and so on, is to use terms that he himself sometimes used, and that seems to invite a kind of ethereal or intangible meaning to what he himself explicitly says in his poetry. And I think we ought to take Wordsworth very explicitly before we get up into fine-spun interpretations and refinements of what the overtones of what he said are. And when he talks about time as you grow older, giving you abundant recompense, he points out as clearly as one can, specifically in terms of everyday living and growing older, what he means. The years that bring the philosophic mind, that suffering deepens and widens and enriches, as well. It's costly, but all the philosophers of life have said this. Wordsworth said it very specifically. It's costly, but without a heaven as abundant recompense, the process of living and growing older itself is not all negative, all lost. And in your terms, what he's organizing us for is a kind of work, but it's the main kind of work that is organizing us for living.
I want to add that I thought Hayden White's comment was not only provocative but cogent, and I want to say one more thing about it. I think that inscription, trying to put down, recording, whether it's archival or not, is surely work in the sense in which you are suggesting. Really, the turnings intricate of verse, which he mentions, the end of Prelude 5, this may of course be vanity. It may be over-sophistication. But I think anyone who has written and who knows that the primal curse may be writing, if not the primal curse, then certainly it's the primal labor. And modern theories of inscription, and I don't simply mean Derrida, but he's certainly in that line, cannot be valued, ideologically speaking, unless inscription, going back to Derrida's critique of Husserl, is conceived of as a founding labor on which culture rests.
Well, I don't accept that. That's the structuralist myth that writing is calvaire.
Is what?
Calvaire. And the notion that the writing is the primal crime. These are all mythifications. And I think that the interesting point that you yourself put your finger on was the problematic nature of the poet's labor itself.
Yes, that's why I hesitated to reply, because first you have to insist on the problematic nature. But if you want an answer, and you seem to want an answer, then it'll be a myth.
Myth is better than an evasion.
I see questions from Martin Mueller, from Michael Fried, and from Francis Ferguson. Perhaps we could proceed in that order to make headway.
I wonder whether the question of social time is not misdirected towards the genre of the lyric, or whether if you talk about romanticism and time, there are certain generic constraints in which whatever the egotistical, sublime, or solipsism of Wordsworth may have been, the lyric is in some intrinsic way less social than the novel or drama. And if one thought about the presence of the experience of time in drama, as where it is, appears in late 18th century and early 19th century drama, often as the metaphor of fate, which is essentially the restrictive force of the past, and where the happy plot is a kind of social liberation. Perhaps if you take a wider generic approach, the question changes a little.
Continue with the gathering of questions, if you will.
I just wanted to start with Morris Dickstein's reference to the notion of Wordsworth as the poet who taught the later 19th century how to feel, and tie it in with something I think Hartmann was suggesting in talking about responsiveness in the Winander Boy. There's a way in which that section of the prelude really almost demands that one learn how to feel. There are very strange things going on there. Wordsworth's invocation at the beginning is not an invocation put in the form of a request. It's an invocation that says, you know this, ye cliffs and islands. And there's a way in which we feel as though reciprocity is being demanded in the poet's arrangement of the situation, as well as in the boy's arrangement of the situation. It's a very peculiar kind of thing, because we start out with that notion of the captive audience, both for the poet and the boy, and realize that the audience, the owls, in becoming not just responsive, but overly responsive, are becoming artists themselves. And it really does seem to me that this is something that tells us a lot about the space that Wordsworth leaves for the whole notion of reading. The Winander Boy, of course, appears in Book 5 of the Prelude, the book on books. And it's very clear, I think, that Wordsworth is orchestrating the situation so that we're aware not simply of the act of reading and the kind of responsiveness there is there, but of the lack of fit, so that there isn't precisely consolation, because there will never be a fitting. And Wordsworth is somehow reminding us that reading occupies a curious status, even when it's not fully present as interpretation. Reading is a kind of middle term for Wordsworth, somewhere between perception and overt interpretation.
I don't know whether possibly you still want to. Sure, I'll throw in something. Partly in response to Hayden, and also in response to some remarks that were made. I think one way of trying to answer the general question of what would be the work implicit in that vision of Romanticism. And here I'm basing myself very much on the professors on the platform, their written works, is the idea of some sort of exchange between the human and the inanimate, and the humanizing of portions of the world, portions of reality, claiming them as fully human. And this, I think, complements what Jeffrey was saying just a moment ago. And it's certainly a point that Professor Fry has made very often in connection with poetry in general, and I think it is a point that it gets made with special force in relation to Romanticism, and could be made, and it's in Jeffrey's book on Wordsworth, and of course it's in every word that Professor Fry has written about Blake. About making the world into a fully human place, and poetry as a kind of, well, taking possession of the world and making of it human. And there are all sorts of very interesting remarks to this effect in Shelley as well. And one could see this as, again, something entirely compatible with the aim of Marxist dialectic, something that would follow the revolution. Now, there's no way, it seems to me, of securing that against the criticism from a Marxist perspective, that represents merely a particular bourgeois individualist perception of a situation, and thinking that it's by some sort of a metaphorical, imagistic, symbolistic, myth-making process that the world can be made into a truly poetic process, the world can be made into a truly human place and truly human life achieved. I don't think there's any way that could really be secured. One would have to simply juxtapose two very powerful accounts like Marx's and Blake's, and see which one compelled the more conviction in one, and whether on some other level they might or might not be compatible. But it certainly seems to me it's open to that charge. But that seems to me one way of defining, or one way of characterizing the actual work being done and the way in which that work, and that would, as a kind of unalienated labor, and a labor that appropriates the world to the human. The other point I wanted to make is that there's a way in which we've been talking about the concept of the moment as if it were itself an unproblematic notion. And I'm thinking of the moment now even a little bit apart from the connotation simply of the present. Whereas it seems to me that one of the characteristics of Romantic poetry and Romantic verse forms in particular, and Romantic syntax, and I suppose the most extraordinary instance of this is Blake's Sunflower, but I think one finds it in the ode form in general, and repeatedly in Romantic lyrics, and repeatedly in German Romantic lyrics as well, is a moment which opens up in very surprising ways, which dilates. You don't know whether it's a moment that is a moment in time or somehow steps out of time, arrests time. There are a whole lot of possibilities in the moment. And you could take this back to a point in the 18th century. I mean, above all, Rousseau in the Reveries. But there are also very suggestive passages in Diderot. There's a kind of simultaneous time consciousness, it seems to me, starting from about the 1760s and moving through Romanticism, of a moment as being this kind of intense, flashing moment in the present, something like Stevens's Time flashed again, and with all the vividness and instantaneity that that implies. It can even be a moment that's already leaving us, as in a poem like Hölderlin's Sonnenuntergang, that sense of being abandoned by time. The moment is already past die Kürze by the time the poem starts.
At least quote the beginning of the Sonnenuntergang, because with Mr. Hamlin on the platform, we must quote Hölderlin. Remember, it goes, the version I remember is, Wo bist du? And it's already gone. The moment is gone. It is from immediately 1 minute past perspective that this happens.
And Weggegangen is the key word. And yet there's another kind of moment, which is a dilated moment, a moment out of time where both Rousseau and Diderot in the 18th century would say time stands still. And it's a moment of intense reverie. It would be related to Romantic reverie, where and within the moment a certain kind of circuitous structure is possible. Something like a path takes place in the ode form. Where you arrive back at something like where you began, even by a process of something almost like recall. I mean, as in Keats' odes, but nevertheless, and where all sorts of references are made to cyclical mythological terms. But nevertheless, it's still within a structure of something like a dilated moment. Anyway, all I wanted to bring out by that, if you'd agree with it, is that the concept of moment, one of the interesting things about Romanticism is not simply that moment becomes extremely important, but the concept of moment itself becomes construed in a number of very striking ways.
Yeah, I have noted questions from Paul Hernady, Marshall Brown, Yuri Streeter, and Peter Hughes. If we may follow in the sequence of my observation, which may be arbitrary, perhaps.
I was very interested in the point raised concerning genre. Would it be a fair statement, and I would like to combine two things, saying something and then try to prompt Professor Fry to respond, because he hasn't had a chance yet to add anything to his original paper. Would it be a fair statement that Romanticism finds its quintessence somehow in the lyric and Historicism in the narrative? And even though, of course, Romantic writers would write plays and novels, but perhaps some of those plays are oriented towards the lyric, whereas historians, even though they quite often fall into lyricisms or try to use some imaginary speeches approaching drama, would still cast most of their text in the narrative frame. Now, if this could be acceptable, then I would be inclined to say that the basic problem of the historian is to try to envision intersubjective action somewhere out there. Whereas the basic problem of the Romanticists, especially when he writes lyric poetry, would be to try to enact vision, to try to temporalize something which, in one sense, is out of time, his own vision of the world. So I would like to play with this contrast of envisioned action as basic for narrative, and particularly in this case for history, and enacted vision as important for lyric poetry, but by extension perhaps for much of romantic writing even outside of lyric poetry.
Well, certainly the question of genre is extremely important in this connection, and it seems to me that it is the function of the lyric to try to define the experience of the moment as such. And I think in most pre-Romantic times, the sense of the moment that is the carpe diem sense, is almost always tragic, because it's inside a framework where the power, if it's to be any good, has to come from somewhere else. That is the effect of human will is always tragic. And so you have heroic carpe diem poems, but the context is always lie drowned with us in endless night. And Marvell's To His Coy Mistress, which is a profoundly tragic poem in the same way. Let us roll all our strength and all our sweetness up into one ball and tear our pleasures of rough strife through the iron gates of life. That is what you will to do, what you seize on, what you do is always tragic and part of the whole sort of death complex. In Romanticism, there's more a sense of the will as informed by a vision, and less of its being dependent on an external power, I think. And this makes for a considerable generic difference between the lyric, which very often revolves around the Verweile doch conception of achieving the moment which will stay in some kind of world that's not of time. And when I spoke of the two genres of the historical novel of Scott and the more realistic tradition that runs from Jane Austen through the 19th century, I was thinking partly of the way in which the Romance writer is evoking certain mythical or romance constants. That is, when the French Revolution broke out, a lot of poets got fascinated with it because it seemed to them to be an epiphany of the myth of the Second Coming. And as soon as it became clear there was going to be just a lot more damn history, they lost interest in it. And so that the genuinely historical novel, it seems to me, is the realistic genre, which preserves a certain period of time in amber, so to speak, as that time, as the reality of that time in the past. The lyric genre is, I think, by its very nature, generically not capable of that. It's trying to break out through it.
Just a word about the lyric which Nari's introduced, answer to the question. The Romantics were very much aware of and concerned about the prominence of the first-person singular in their poetry, not only lyric, but in the prelude. As Wordsworth said about the prelude, it's a thing unprecedented in literary history that a poet should have talked so much about himself. And they were very concerned to maintain poetry as not an isolated voice singing solitude like the nightingale in Shelley's image in the Defense of Poetry, but to make it still a communal act of some sort, which is not only an act of communication, but identification between the poet and others. And I think one prominent answer they themselves gave refused to separate the lyric and the first-person poem from other genre in its function, social and human function, by insisting, as